Well, good day, everyone. Welcome again to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. Today, I'm excited to bring you a special interview with my guest, Andy Bannister. Now, Andy has been around the apologetics world for quite some time. He's the author of various different books, but his most recent one, How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. It's something I think that a lot of Christians struggle with. If you've ever had a panic attack when worrying about sharing your faith, or just simply felt that you have somehow wanted to share your faith but didn't know quite the way to go, this will be the book for you. So stay tuned and get ready for a great hour with Andy Bannister on Come Let Us Reason Together. Okay, well, again, welcome everyone to Come Let Us Reason Together. I am so excited to be joined with my new friend, Andy Bannister. Now, Andy and I have kind of seen each other online back and forth for many years, but it's the first time I actually get to talk to you, Andy. So welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lenny. Again, we've sort of known each other on and off virtually at distance for years. I've been following the stuff that you've done, enjoyed it. So thank you so much for having me onto the podcast, onto the show. It's very kind of you.
Yes, and you're also being very kind because you're in Scotland right now, which puts you
well, England actually.
Oh, you're in England
today. Scotland. We moved about 18 months ago, but the UK. So yes. It's late in the evening, so my brain is slowing down, but we'll do our best.
Well, it shouldn't be too bad. Knowing how your brain works, but
you're too kind.
So, a couple of things. First of all, Andy, tell me about your story. How did you get involved in apologetics? How did you become interested in these kinds of topics? And what motivates you to kind of come and write these kind of books?
Yeah, well, thank you. What a great question, Lenny. So I got into apologetics, I suppose, in some ways relatively late. I know guys who got into it into their teens. In my case, I was well into my late 20s, and I was involved in doing youth ministry at my local church. Hadn't really thought about apologetics or didn't even know what it was. Then one day, a guy came to our church. He did a seminar on Muslims and understanding and reaching our Muslim friends. And he described how every Sunday afternoon he was going up to a place called Speaker's Corner. That's part of one of our big parks in London.
Is this Jay Smith that you're talking about?
This is Jay Smith,
okay.
Yeah. So Jay came. And he described how he was going there, standing on a ladder and preaching to the hundreds of Muslims who could be found. If anyone listening to this has heard Jay, you can look him up on YouTube. He's very persuasive, very engaging. So I was a bit sort of overawed. And he said, well, Andy, come to Speaker's Corner. Come and see what we do next week. So the following week, I went up to London and I met Jay, and he was carrying two step ladders, one over each shoulder. And I said to him, why have you got two ladders? He went, well, I'm going to stand on one and preach, Andy, and you're going to stand on the other and preach. And I said, I thought you should come and see what we do. He went, the best view is on a ladder. I went, Jay, I've never talked to a Muslim before. Oh, Andy, they're easy. Anyone could do it. Oh, okay, well, I've never preached on the street before. It's easy. Anybody could do it. Lenny, he was so wrong. It was not even funny, because I got on a ladder and the Muslims there ate me alive. They tore me to pieces. They threw questions and objections. I had no idea where to begin. I remember getting down from the ladder after an hour of this, thinking, well, I guess I need to become a Muslim because they've got everything. I have nothing. Went home, laid awake all night, tossing and turning. Following morning, I decided, well, I'll go to the local Christian bookstore. I knew the guy who ran it, and I told him my story and said, have you got any advice? He went, well, what you need is apologetics. I said, what's that? It sounds like a breakfast cereal. He went, no. It's the part of, as you know, the Christian faith concerned with giving answers. He sold me some books. I read, and I spent the next couple of weeks reading every spare moment, Lenny. I got answers to everything they fired at me. Went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later, loaded for bear, as you Americans like to say, and they had new questions. And I looked stupid all over again. But for the next 3 months, I would go to Speaker's Corner on the weekend, would be humiliated in public, would read during the weeks to catch up. And during those 3 months, God did a number of things. He gave me a love of Muslims and engaging them, despite their sometimes annoying questions. He gave me a love of public evangelism. And I discovered I had this academic turn. I was 28 at this point, hadn't been to university, wasn't from that kind of family. But I discovered actually I've got a kind of mind that God's wired for this kind of stuff, and just fell in love with digging deeper into stuff. And that was the beginning of a journey that led eventually to getting a PhD in Islamic studies. Eventually, I went to Bible college and then carried on and kept going. It led to then doing ministry in Canada. I did 6 years out there with an apologetics ministry, and then now 7 years in the UK. So it all started with Muslims and their questions.
Wow, so you didn't start in the shallow end of the pool. You jumped right into Speaker's Corner.
I didn't know it was the piranha-infested deep end of the pool, Lenny. But
that's right.
Yeah, you very much.
Well, and obviously Canada and the UK, where you're going to have a lot more divergent, a lot more secular ideologies present. It's not quite the same as the US, where I would imagine that people would think, oh, you got a little more cushy over there now. So it was a baptism by fire.
It was. And the interesting thing is, you mentioned, of course, the US. Well, the US is changing.
Yes, it is.
Isn't it? I mean, Scotland, where I was once an incredibly religious country. Very much like America was, a decade or so ago. And of course, it secularized very quickly. So did Canada, actually, very much in the 70s when that swept through. And I think now with America, you folks are following some of the curves that we've seen in other parts of the Western world. So I think, one of the great challenges for Christians, I think in the US, and I've got many friends over there still, is to go, okay, don't despair, because God is bigger than the nations and cultural moves, but be aware that the questions are changing.
Yes.
And I think the challenge in apologetics, right, is to go, let's make sure we're answering the questions for today, not the questions of yesterday.
Oh, isn't that true? And it's changed so much. Even I would say within the last 5 years. I tell people, 5 years ago, there was a big push on moral relativism and explaining how there's no such thing as absolute moral values, and what's right for me may not be right for you. And today, you go on college campuses and kids are absolutely certain what's right and wrong. And if you're not on the right hand side of things, you're going to get canceled. I mean, there's a moral, braggadocio that they seem to exercise.
Well, I think the other thing that's going on that we need to be aware of, you're absolutely right, that there's that issue. I think a lot of people are not asking, the sort of does God exist type questions, but they're asking questions that really can only be answered if God exists. So a good example, when I'm ever teaching, students and younger Christians on this, I say take the justice issue. That's everywhere in our culture.
Right.
Now, once you learn to deal with that, actually it's very exciting, because it's such an opportunity to bridge from there to the God question. But the other thing I think that's happened, everyone knows sort of C.S. Lewis, right? But the other
by the way, it's 60th anniversary of his death today. Yeah, that we're talking.
Is it
60 years ago?
I thought it was the 23rd. I thought it's tomorrow. You might be right.
No, I think it's the 22nd. Yeah, same day as John F. Kennedy.
It would be ironic if I was corrected by an American.
No, like I said, it's easy because Kennedy was shot the same day. So
you're right. And what happened is, of course, Lewis's death was masked, somewhat. It was there was someone else famous who died the same day, and I forget who it was. I want to say Aldous Huxley. Doesn't sound quite right.
I think you're right. Someone else. I think Huxley was the third.
It was 3 on the same day. We digress into obituaries and death dates. Where I was going with that, so Lewis, very well known. The one who's not so well known, who was a big influence on Lewis, of course, was G.K. Chesterton. And Chesterton reputedly said, when men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. And human beings, of course, are inherently religious. And I think one of the things we're seeing in the US, in Canada, in Europe, where I am, is that although people would say they perhaps no longer believe in God, or to believe in God to lesser degrees, what's happened is these newer religions have come in on the back of that. Yeah. So a lot of the kind of, for want of a better word, woke ideologies, that word is helpful but also unhelpful, but those kind of things like transgenderism, right. Certain political ideologies, to an extent environmentalism pushed where it becomes almost a green religion. Those things have come in and filled that void because people need that bigger thing to believe in. And if it's not God, it's going to be something else. And I think what for Christians that means is that pushes us back into the first century, the era the church began in, when actually there's all these competing religions out there. A lot of people haven't heard of Christianity, or if they have, it's been a mere rumor of what it is. And suddenly we can't assume anymore that when we say, hey, I believe in Jesus, that people go, oh, yeah, I know what you guys stand for. A lot of people are like, what? Okay, what's all that about then?
Yeah, there's a lot there. But before we jump into it, first of all, I want to say one of the things that dovetails very nicely is, of course, you wrote a book called The God That Doesn't Exist, which and that kind of
the atheist
the atheist who,
didn't
I'm sorry,
exist.
the atheist who doesn't exist.
That's
Yes,
right.
that's right. Which is kind of a part of this idea, right? Where you're telling about, a straw man version of what people say they believe and believe. Why don't you unpack that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so the atheist didn't exist. Thanks for that. That's unbelievably, it's coming up next year. I think it's the 10th anniversary
Nice.
of that book coming out, which is amazing because we're doing a 10th anniversary edition. So it's amazing how quickly time goes by. So the big idea behind that book, Lenny, was that so in 2006 the so-called New Atheism kicks off. Richard
Right.
Dawkins, Chris Hitchens, Dan Dennett on your side of the Atlantic, and one or two others kicking around in there, Sam Harris. And those guys, their books were selling millions of copies. They were all over the media. They were on TV, chat shows, YouTube channels watched by millions and so forth. And I remember looking at them thinking, this is interesting. And I remember actually then reading their books and going, gosh, these are not particularly impressive arguments. They're packaged incredibly well and cleverly.
Yeah.
And then what I noticed is Christians were writing responses. And there were some very learned, erudite responses. So, Alistair McGrath, very well-known Christian theologian and apologist. Friend of mine, no Alistair, wrote a couple of really good books, The Dawkins Delusion, responding to the God Delusion. And those books didn't get that much traction. And I came to the conclusion with the mistake we were making is we were fighting facts and rhetoric, feelings and rhetoric with facts. And that doesn't always work. So I thought, okay, we don't want to dispense with facts. What would happen if we tried to write a book that was much higher on rhetoric and used humor? Because I try and be funny when I communicate. That's sort of my kind of style. I thought, what would it look like to write a funny, laugh out loud engagement with the New Atheism, such that you could give it to a friend who'd been impressed by Dawkins, and you could say, you may not agree with everything that Bannister says, but I promise you'll have a laugh as you read. And I also found as well that some of the arguments the New Atheists were advancing, when you actually analyze them, Lenny, they're actually quite funny. So a good example of that would be I think the second chapter in that book plays with the idea that a lot of the New Atheists were claiming, well, atheism is just the lack of belief in God, so we don't need to defend it. As an atheist, I don't have anything to defend. I just lack something. And so in the book, I play with the idea of, imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop with a friend who sort of gaily announces they don't believe in Sweden anymore. And you say, well, hang on a moment. Where's your evidence for that? And they go, no. I just lack a belief in a small Nordic country. I don't need to give you evidence for my lack of belief. Clearly, there's something wrong with that argument. Clearly, there is. Just as there is someone saying the same for God. And then the not existing part, I've got the chapter in there that looks at the science sort of stuff and the way that New Atheists were weaponizing science. I pull out some of the really reductionist stuff on mind and consciousness that people like Dan Dennett were playing with. And I introduce and I make the argument there. If you explain away mind, and if you explain away consciousness, which Dennett effectively does, saying that the human mind is, what we call mind is produced by the same forces that cause continental drift and earthquakes and weather patterns. It's to go, well, you haven't merely just thrown God away, you've actually explained humanity away, and you are quite literally, the atheist doesn't exist anymore. You've explained away your own existence and erased yourself in the process. And so that book was a lot of fun. And what we're going to do with the anniversary edition, which makes me sound very old writing anniversary editions of my own books, Lenny, is that we've realized that we're now 15 years on from the height of the New Atheism. So it started in 06, really peaked about 09, 2010. Although those guys are not around in the same way anymore, Chris Hitchens is dead. Sam Harris has gone really weird and talks about Buddhism a lot. Dan Dennett has just got a bigger and bigger beard and is becoming more like Santa Claus every day. And Dawkins is just slowly going increasingly like a parody of himself. The arguments that they popularize are still in the culture. So their arguments have metastasized. And so you'll find a lot of people who go, oh, yes, religion causes evil. Yeah, of course it does. Most wars are caused by religion. Or science. Yeah, of course, science and faith don't fit together. Well, those are new atheist arguments, and they're still out there. So the updated version of the book is going to play with that a little bit, but then also look at the fact that the public intellectual mood is changing, that I think you've got a lot more public intellectuals, both on your side of the Atlantic and mine, who are beginning to talk about faith positively. again, I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that actually maybe Christian faith actually produced some things in culture that are worth hanging on to. Now, you and I think Christian faith is more than just that, but it's a good place to start the conversation.
Yeah, you point that out. There's we can kind of name names. Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, folks who are not Christians by any stretch of the imagination or have not identified as such, were really agnostic and have made the case more than once and more vigorously than many how Christianity is a fundamental basis for the Western world, for freedom, for ideas of course, individualism. There's Larry Seidentop, Inventing the Individual, which was a great scholastic work. But we can go on with this. Now, coming to your new book, your most recent book, one of the things you said is, we do have a lot of competing religions these days, but I think it's a little bit different than it has been in the past. So say you're a second century Christian and you're living in a pagan culture, you're living in the Roman world, or you're the Apostle Paul even on Mars Hill in Acts chapter 17. And when you come and say, hey, there's this statue to this unknown God, right? You guys don't know him. I know him. Let me explain him to you. And Paul, of course, does a masterful job. This is like a TED Talk model on how to present your faith to an intellectual, non-believing audience. But one of the things that I think is different from that point to this point is the fact that back then they really hadn't heard of Christianity at all.
Yes.
And they, what is this new thing you're talking about? Maybe we should listen to you further. One of the difficulties you have today when you want to engage folks is, although they may not have truly heard what Christianity is or truly understand the beliefs, they think they've understood it. They think they have heard it. So I think there's a little bit of a difference between living in a pre-Christian pagan culture and what I would call a post-Christian pagan culture. Now, in your book, how do you then begin these conversations? Because you have in your table of contents, you have the first step to fearless evangelism. So, and evangelism in everyday places. So tell me how in this culture we can overcome these barriers where people just, I've heard that was my parents' faith, and I'm dismissing it, that kind of thing.
What a brilliant question. Let me say a couple of things straight away, Lenny, and then we'll dive into some of the stuff from the book. Is that I think that I intimated earlier that I think in the US you're lagging slightly behind the secularization curve that we've seen in Canada and the UK. Because I would say in the UK what's going on is you have got an increasing number of people who would be Generation Z for you Americans, and a little bit older than that. Put it this way, 35 and under. You meet an increasing number of people here who actually quite literally have probably not even heard of Christianity, or the very least it's a word, but there's no content at all. So there is a blank slate going on, which is unbelievable. It still boggles my mind that somebody can come through the UK education system and not really be able to tell you, okay, tell me a couple of, tell me what.
There's no Church of England teachings that have stayed.
Nope, because you can be post Christian. I know people who their parents weren't Christian, the grandparents weren't Christian. So if you really push, maybe there's a half remembered lesson they heard at school about something, but it's so jumbled up and it's so confused. There's no baggage associated with it. It's meaningless. In the same way that I could probably tell you a couple of facts about the siege of Troy, the fall of Troy, but I wouldn't be able to tell you more than I learned something when I was 13. So that's positive. When you get a bit older, you've got more of the experience and the encounter with Christianity or cultural Christianity. And the cultural Christianity piece is interesting because C.S. Lewis, who we mentioned earlier, and by the way, I was checking earlier, you're dead right. It's the 22nd of November. I'm corrected by an American on British history. There we are. To go, there's a humbling lesson. I'd have to try and do the reverse for you on American history before the show's over. Right. Lewis uses an analogy where he said, He's an analogy from medicine where I think he talked about inoculation. The way that inoculation works, right, is you expose a patient to a weak, watered-down version of the virus, they develop immunity, and then when we meet the real thing, they're protected. And Lewis raises this question in one of his essays where he says, is it just possible that we've inoculated culture against Christianity? We've exposed it to a weak, watered-down version of the real thing, and people think they've built up immunity. And I think some of that's going on. So how do we deal with that? Let me talk about that in just a second. The chapters in the book, I start the book by talking about my own journey to evangelism. Obviously, Speaker's Corner, I've described as part of that, particularly with apologetics, but with evangelism more specifically, when I was in the secular workplace years ago, I was very much an undercover Christian. I didn't talk about my faith because I was afraid of a whole range of things. Afraid of looking like an idiot, hence the book title. Afraid of being asked a question I couldn't answer. I had never even heard of apologetics. That wouldn't come until 7 years later. And then afraid of implications of my career, all kinds of things. So those kind of fears, I think, shut a lot of Christians down. Even before we get to the how should we do it, people never get to the how we should do it stage because the fear of what might happen is such a problem. And so in the book, I do a couple of things around that. Firstly, I have a whole chapter where we look at let's break fear down. When you say I'm afraid of evangelism, it can be helpful with people again. Well, let's be specific. I used to be afraid of flying. And what helped get me through that was a pilot friend who went, no, that's too general. Let's explore what precisely it is that you're afraid of.
Yeah.
And that, as we dug that through, it turned out for me it was control. I like to be in control. I'm a control freak. And sitting in a metal tube while two people up the front pull the levers and I can't do anything, that's about as far from control as you could possibly get. And when I finally identified that was the issue, other things got sorted. And so, for example, if it's fear of reputation that's holding you back from evangelism, maybe the underlying issue is you have a little idol in your life going on there. But actually, it's your reputation and your standing with your peers, your colleagues, your friends that's actually become central to your faith and displaced Christ slightly. And that's quite uncomfortable diagnosing that, but it's also helpful because then you can, in terms of your own discipleship, one can reorientate that. And then once Christ is in the right place, is in his rightful place, some of those other fears come by the wayside. And there are other examples of how we can deal with that. And then I also, in that every evangelism in everyday places chapter that you cite, I talk about what was massively eye-opening for me was encountering lots of different friends who in different ways were sharing Christ very naturally, not in a forced way, not in a kind of I've learned a method at church I'm downloading onto people. What they all had in common, and I tell a really wide range of stories there because I want to give people a real breadth. They all had asking good questions and using questions to start conversations in common. And of course, when you look at the Gospels, Jesus is the master question asker. 308 questions Jesus asks in the Gospels. And that drives through to the core of the book where, I take people into some questions they can learn to use. Some of that ground's being gone over by others. I mean, Greg Kokel's book, Tactics, very well-known one. I mean, it's a slightly higher level. I would often say to people, this is the entry-level book that after you've read mine, you'll be ready for Greg. But the question that I really lean into in the book is, for me, is probably the most important chapter, is based on that Acts 17 model that you cite, and it's the wandering question. And it's great because if you've got people who are suspicious about Christianity or they've heard about it or they've got baggage, you can just do an end run around that. Don't go there. Start from the things that they already care about, whether that's justice or identity or the environment or whatever it is. And you can do just what Paul does in Athens. You can basically say, that thing that you're passionate about, that thing that you care about, that thing that animates you, that's brilliant, because Paul starts by commending the Athenians, even though they're a bunch of crazy polytheists. He's like, this is great. You dudes are so religious. And if we can learn to make that connection, then he brings in the gentle, or not so gentle, but the gentle critique of going, hey, but I just wondered whether the thing that you've kind of centered everything in can quite deliver the goods. And then when he's got people ready, he brings Jesus in. And I think the mistake we sometimes make when we're evangelizing or trying to share our faith, Lenny, with people who are post-Christian or have had really bad experiences with the church, which sometimes happen, we leap straight to the church bit, the God bit, the Jesus bit, and the barriers go right up, rather than we build those bridges, we get people intrigued. And I think it was Blaise Pascal, wasn't it, who famously said, talk about the gospel in such a way that good people wish that it were true, and then show that it is. And, you mentioned someone like Douglas Murray earlier. I mean, Doug's an interesting chap. I mean, you've got a gay atheist journalist you know, used to hate Christianity and everything it stood for. Now he calls himself a Christian atheist, in that he deeply appreciates the values of Christianity. To hear him talk sometimes, you'd think he'd actually become a Christian. He's not there yet. We're praying for him. But it's been because I think he's had great people around him who've gently helped him see, but Douglas, the things that you care about, they do not work on atheism. They really, really don't.
Right.
Freedom of speech
Absolutely.
is nonsense on atheism, but it makes sense on Christianity.
So I've taken kids up to UC Berkeley, and we go on campus and we engage in conversations.
Wow, that's going into the lion's den.
That's close as I'll get to a speaker's corner, I think. But what we do is we use surveys, and I teach them a similar tactic, where because first of all, with a survey, right, you can talk shoulder to shoulder, not nose to nose. And usually they're structured in a way to get into conversation. So it's, do you believe in a God or a higher power? Absolutely not. Everybody at Berkeley seems to be atheist. Do you believe there's an absolute right and wrong, absolute morality for all people? No. And you ask a couple other questions, and one question is, what's one problem plaguing humanity? And everybody at Berkeley has an answer to that question.
Amazing, isn't it?
It's like the subjugation of women, the one percenters, the environment. Pick your oppressed class. They will tell you. And then the very next question is, well, can you answer this for me? If there's no absolute right and wrong, how can that be a problem for all people? Because you're needing a moral foundation, right? So that's what usually, that's where the conversation starts to take the turn, because now they have to provide support for the belief that they have, and they have nothing upon which to ground it. And that's way we kind of have approached it. And
it's brilliant, isn't it? Those kind of approaches. I'm really excited to hear that works.
Yeah,
for you.
it is. And asking questions is so important. And I've made that point as well. It is the way, because first of all, you're not bearing the burden of proof, but you are actually finding out a little bit more about your interlocutor. You're finding out about that individual.
Yes.
You're not just trying to put a notch on your Bible either. You're understanding who they are, what their history is, because the conversation could go into a direction where it would change and lead to a different idea, because as you say, people will associate God viscerally. They'll associate him with maybe an abusive father or something traumatic that happened at church, and you have to deal with those issues as much as you have to deal with the kind of Kalam cosmological argument approach as well.
Yeah, I think those are brilliant. And what encourages me is also, it's always encouraging when stuff I've been trying out other people are doing, so it confirms to me that I'm not completely nuts. The four questions we've talked about two of my books, the idiot one and the atheist one. The one that became between those was the Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God one that came out in 2021. And in that, there's four questions that I teach, and it's your three there plus another one which I found was a helpful one. So there's do you believe in some kind of God, and if so, what is God like, which is your higher power question. The what's gone wrong with the world. And then the one that I put before that is, what do you think a human being is? That's a really interesting question. Tell me what you think a human being is. Are we just...
How do people respond to that? What do they say?
That often throws people. I often find people go, oh. Now, sometimes they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, for example, some people might think we're just the stuff of which we're made. Some people might think we're just another primate that's been evolved by the time just advanced natural selection. Other people think there's a spiritual component to us, or there's a whole range of options. What do you think? Now, what's interesting, of course, the more atheistic ones tend to go, well, we're just the stuff of which we're made. And in one sense, the more reductionist, the better. Because then again, the trick is not to respond and go, oh, okay, well, have you thought about this? Go, okay, that's interesting. Then when you move on to the what's gone wrong with the world, that's where I then tie those up and say, well, hang on a moment. A moment ago, you've said we're just particles in motion, or whatever you've said. And but now you're getting quite animated. The way that some of these little, sacks of chemicals are treating one another is wrong. And then the final question I find we'll sometimes throw in is, so what do you think the solution is? That's an interesting one. What's gone wrong? What do you think the solution is? But I love your one as well of going, do you think there's, absolute standards of and right and wrong, or is just justice just just relative.
Yeah.
And however you mix those up, as you say, to get people talking, to get people thinking, and then I think there's a great power, isn't there, Lenny, in the temptation for us who are apologists is to look for the contradiction, and then we tell them, hey, hang on a moment, that doesn't make sense, you're wrong. People then get defensive and react. If we can expose the fact that there is a hole in their worldview by question asking and effectively just sit back and not get smug. The key is not to be smug and do a gotcha, but just go, have you not considered it's interesting that these two things that you've just said, do you sort of see there's an issue here? And then the other piece of the jigsaw that I learned from an American friend of mine. So, we Brits are very happy to learn from Americans. Greg Gansel over at used to be at Harvard.
Greg's at Biola. He's a good friend. Yeah,
he's Biola now. Yeah, so Greg's book, A Reasonable God, was a real light bulb moment for me when I read that. And we've had him on the podcast that I do at So Less the Ministry I lead. In that book, he introduces what he calls, I think, the fittingness argument, where rather than look for knockdown arguments, hey, here's the Kalam cosmological arguments. You see Bill Craig do that in a debate. It's amazing, but it is angled a bit like, here's a battering ram coming through the front door, you can't possibly resist it. Greg's like, well, let's put some things on the table, human rights and justice, meaning, purpose, truth, beauty, as many things as we like. Bring them on. The more the merrier that we pile things up. And then we ask the question, which worldview do these things fit best with? Doesn't matter if it doesn't be 100%, where do they generally come to land? And it doesn't take a lot of work for someone to see these things don't fit that well with atheism. And the fittingness piece is fun because if somebody goes, yeah, but what about? You can afford to occasionally concede things. So if somebody says, hey, what about evolution? I go, yeah, okay, I can grant you at first look that maybe looks better for atheism. I'll grant you that one. So you've got one in your column, but over here we've got 20 things in our column, mate. Of going, where does the most of the data looks like it fits? And that kind of humility that I think that Greg's learned to lead with and bring into conversations, I think that can be really powerful, because sometimes as apologists, I think we can just be a little bit smug. I know I was when I was younger, that we've got all these arguments, aren't they amazing? Tremble before my arguments, ye pagans, and repent. And
unfortunately, yeah. I mean, it not only is that easy, sometimes we don't know what we're talking about. And on the other side, they're just as smug about the Dawkins arguments that they've read. So again, it's
yes,
you're coming up against two folks who are not listening to one another, but talking at one another. And that's why I say, the first piece that you have to do is you have to slow down, and you really have to listen, because it makes a difference. I tell a story. I won't go into all the details of talking to a Jehovah's Witness who came to my door. Or a Mormon who would come to my door. And the first question I always ask is, there's a lot of faiths out there. What is it that drew you to this one? Why have you always followed this faith? And the Jehovah's Witness lady said no. She was lamenting the fact that she had an older brother who had a mental development disability, who would really make him do things that she said were unspeakable, and ultimately it took his life. But she had a fond affection for her older brother growing up, and when he died, the idea that he would be somehow cast into hell was abominable to her. And so she said, I started a religious quest, and lo and behold, I came upon the truth of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, if you understand that the Jehovah's Witnesses believe in soul sleep, they don't believe in hell, now you've got a whole new insight into what's driving this individual. So if I'm going to talk to her about Granville Sharp's rule of Greek grammar and was Jesus a God versus the God, or things like that, I mean, I'm missing the boat, right? That's not where our conversation needs to be. It needs to be on grace and forgiveness, and you're only culpable for your knowledge, and how God can save those who would otherwise can be considered unsavable. That's a whole different conversation. You don't know unless you ask, unless you listen. And that's a big point. And I noticed, throughout the book, it's always about question.
Yeah. And I would say that's an amazing story, Lenny. I would also just add to it that I think even if it's a question that we think we know the answer to, because that's where the biggest danger comes. I mean, I don't. You may encounter this the same as I do, because we're involved in not dissimilar ministry at times. I often get asked in Christian audiences. Somebody will raise their hand and say, "So, what's the hardest question you've ever had?" And I think they're expecting some wonderful little flight of philosophy. And I've learned to say, actually, I will often say an answer to that. The hardest question, actually, is always the one I've just received, if it's for a non-Christian, because if it's one that I've heard 1,000 times before, the danger is that you go into autopilot. So someone says, "Oh, you're a Christian. How can you believe in a good God and there's suffering in the world?" It is so easy, if you've been around apologetics for even a short period of time, to go, "I know this one. I know this one. I know this." It's like Donkey and Shrek. Pick me, pick me, and you go motoring in, and you miss that there is something different. And as I say, your point about slowing down, I'm always teaching students, when someone raises a question, I think that a great starting point is always to go back with a question and say, "Okay, that's a really interesting question. Why do you ask it?" So on the suffering question, I want to know, are they asking this because they're being clever, because they've read Dan Dennett and he said this is a great problem that he doesn't think Christians can answer, or are they asking this because their mum's just died of cancer? And your point there, you got right into the personal, which is interesting, with your Jehovah's Witness friend on the doorstep. And that reminds me, by the way, just the story, it was interesting when you were telling that story. The Jehovah's Witnesses, I mean, my wife, when she was at college, one of the assignments they were given, they were doing a worldview class. They were given the assignment of interviewing people from different faiths. She found an old lady in her community who was in her 70s, was a Jehovah's Witness. And so Astrid went and interviewed her and asked her the question you effectively asked your friend, why did you choose this faith? And I will never forget the story of what the answer was. The answer was, well, I'd actually been, going along to church for about 40 years, sort of part of the church. She was on the fringes of the church. Her husband died in a road traffic accident. No one from the church visited. Not a single pastoral visit. Nothing. One day, there's a knock at the door. It's the Jehovah's Witnesses. She answers the door in a complete state because she's grieving. They came in. They loved her. They looked after her. They welcomed her. They invited her to their community. They, put loads of pastoral support in. Result is she became a Jehovah's Witness, and purely emotional reasons. And so that's a lesson for me, actually, that apologetics has to have a pastoral component to it there, and that gets missed sometimes. I think it's as much pastoring as it is intellect and bringing it together.
Yeah, I agree. There was I had another instance where a couple of guys came up and I asked the same question, and one of them said, "Well, I was 17 years old and it was before Christmas, and a couple of guys were doing their pioneer service, knocking on my door, and they said, Jesus really wasn't born on December 25th. Because, what do you mean? How can that be? It's Jesus' birthday. He goes, no. It says in Luke that the sheep were in the fields, or in Matthew, and the sheep were in the fields, and therefore, it would have been too cold in December to feed your sheep, so we know that that's not true. Wow, he goes, I've never heard that, but, okay, let me think about it. He called his pastor, and his pastor said, "Are these Jehovah's Witnesses?" And he goes, "Yes." He goes, "Oh, well, you don't have to worry about them. You don't have to listen to them." And that's it. And the guy looked at me and he said, "If my pastor was hiding this from me, I wonder what else he was hiding from me. So therefore I became a Jehovah's Witness." And it was just the dismissal of it was just staggering. Yep. Now, there are answers to that question that, hey, I don't know if you've ever been to Israel, but Israel and Southern California, the climates are incredibly similar. And right now, today, we're looking at, 28 degrees Celsius. We're looking at an 80-degree day today, November.
Same here in England, Lenny. I mean, November here, it's lovely. It hasn't rained.
I'm a cyclist, and I know that's not true. But there can be heat waves. But regardless, nobody said that was the actual date that Jesus was born. There's other reasons why we hold to that. But the point being is, if you dismiss these guys, if you just, and really, that's the story of the Latter-day Saints. When Joseph Smith was first spinning his yarns, most theologians and most pastors said, "Oh, this is too fantastic for anyone to believe," and they dismissed it. And of course, now 100 and almost 200 years later, we have the LDS entrenched in our society. So the pastoral component is important, the intellectual component is important, but in all, don't dismiss anybody. Understand what it is that they're searching for. Again, it's, Jesus sometimes, when he talked to that woman at the well, he spent a pretty good time engaging her and understanding where she was. And what's fascinating was he kind of took almost a psychologist approach. Psychologists will tell you that in order for your patient to see the behavioral change that they need to see, they need to kind of come up with the idea. They need to see the realization themselves. And that's kind of what you're saying, is by asking questions, by having them start to feel the tension in their belief system, the contradictions that are inherent in they're coming to the realization that this isn't sustainable. And I think that's why that becomes a much more powerful, not only apologetic, but ultimately when you actually do have a strong belief, it's a significantly big change. Now,
I think so. And by the way, I was also struck by the fact that as we were talking there about, the you asking the questions of your friends, and we were talking about getting to the question behind the question. Just that part of my brain just lit up. I mean, of course, I always love trying to find the examples of where Jesus does this, because of course he's the master question asker, and you gave an example there. There's that lovely moment, isn't there, where Jesus is confronted with the healing of the man born blind, and of course Jesus looks at him and goes, "What would you like me to do for you?" Which is amazing, because you think, it's pretty obvious that he's blind, right? But Jesus, the very Son of God, takes the moment to slow down and look at the guy and say, "What can I do for you? What's really going on here?" So Jesus does this when you'd have thought the answer would be obvious, and sometimes the answer is obvious, but actually to slow right down. My other favorite example in the Gospels, which again I know it's a textual variant, but there we are, it belongs somewhere, is the woman caught in adultery in John's Gospel, which a lot of New Testament critics think is a piece of Jesus tradition that's just floating around. Just very conscious about Bart Ehrman made a lot of hay out of that one, because the stuff in your Bible that you should know. Anyway, that story, I digress. It was it was the Christmas thing that made me think I needed to do the caveat there. But I love that scene, because where Jesus bends right down and starts writing in the dust, and lots of theologians and commentators have expended vast amounts of ink trying to work out what he was writing. And I think the answer is, it doesn't actually matter. It matters not a jot. He could have been doing tic-tac-toe, quite frankly. What he's doing is getting down to her level. He's coming right down to eye level, and now he's in the dust with her, looking eye to eye when they have that little conversation. And we need to do the equivalent in our evangelism. We need to get eye to eye with people. We need to slow right down. We need to enter their world. We need to take the time. We need to find out how they tick. And by the way, the other reason, you asked earlier about why I wrote, this book at this time. I love apologetics. You do too, and there are many of us involved in apologetics over the years, and there are so many good things about it. But one of my concerns increasingly with apologetics is that as the discipline expands and becomes so many good resources out there, the average person, I hate to use the word average because that makes it sound like we're sort of somehow putting ourselves on pedestals. People who don't have the time to do this professionally, who are working Monday through Friday in the school, the bank, the hospital, look at this and go, "Well, I can't do this. I can't master these arguments." Lenny threw the term Granville Sharp rule around a moment ago. What the heck is that? And so people disengage. And what I wanted to do was take some of the great resources and tools that are out there and package them in a form that the average person can use. And I quite frankly think there's not much new that's going to be written in apologetics. The arguments have been mapped out, the work's been done. What we need is a lot more work being done, getting stuff into the hands of people to use in the everyday stuff, because those of us who are doing full-time ministry, we aren't out in the workplaces engaging at the sharp end of the coalface. Our brothers and sisters are.
Exactly.
How do we help them? People haven't got the time to master this stuff, but who can learn to ask good questions, listen well, and then connect Jesus into those conversations.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think for anyone who's trepidatious about such things, I mean, find a friend at work that you can go out to lunch with once a week. And he'll have a question, and it's okay to say, "You know what? I've not looked that up. I've not researched that. That's a really good question. Can we have lunch again next week? And maybe we can have a discussion on it." And what will happen is you'll start to master that. Or if you want to write a letter to the local paper, it forces you to do a little digging just in one area. You don't have to be a master of everything. Just do a little digging in one area. And then when you get that, say, well, what's the next question? And then all of a sudden you'll have this, you'll start to grow in your knowledge. It's kind of, how you did it at Speaker's Corner. It's the same idea, but you can do that virtually through letters, or once a week having a non-threatening discussion with a friend at work, things like that.
Yeah,
and it
absolutely
will grow.
I think you can. The other couple of things I'd add to that, that's brilliant advice. I think the other thing I'd add, Lenny, is don't go into this on your own. So one of the mistakes we've made in the church is encouraging lone wolf evangelism. And so you have these giant personalities who go on their own and blaze a trail, and everyone looks at them and goes, wow, I wish I was like that guy, with Billy Graham or whoever. And that's great. But then the other problem you have is people think, well, if I'm going to do evangelism, I'm going to be on my own. There's no one backing me up. Well, get a group of people around you. Get together with other Christians. If you're not in a small group at church, get in a small group at church. Get 2 or 3 friends around you who are also concerned about reaching their friends, their workplaces, and then share your stories and encourage one another. One of the things I loved at Speaker's Corner was that we'd go to Speaker's Corner every week. And then we'd spend a couple of hours down there doing evangelism and street preaching. Then a bunch of about 10, 15 of us would go off and get cheap fried food, Kentucky Fried Chicken, or, other fried food places are available. And we would sit around, we'd have a good laugh together, time of fellowship. We'd share what had gone well. We'd commiserate over what had gone badly. We'd encourage each other, laugh together, pray for one another. And what it meant is you felt you were not on your own. And it was great to know, however tough it sometimes was, and it was, you weren't doing it on your own. And I think if you are sitting here listening to this going, but my workplace, man, I'm the only Christian. Yeah, I can't change that. But you have got Christian friends at church or wherever who you could say, hey, I'm going to start trying to be more active in my faith at work. Could we pray once a week, or perhaps after church over coffee? And then just because it would really encourage me, and you're not doing it on your own. I think that can be really helpful. And then the one other thing I would add as well, your point about all of us can learn some arguments and so on. Again, it's great advice. Learn the questions that your friends are asking. Don't feel you have to master the whole of apologetics. But look, for folks who even listening to that are like, but hang on, I struggle with words. They're not my thing. I have friends like that. One of the things I've found really helpful is to appreciate there are different styles of evangelism. So one of my friends, and we have a lot of friends in common, so you may know Mark Mittelberg. Yeah, Mark. So Mark's book, which would be even more impressive if I can remember the title, his latest book on evangelism looks at different styles of evangelism in the New Testament. And Mark says about 5 or 6 or 7 different styles of evangelism right there in the scriptures. And you see that includes things like hospitality. Some people, their evangelistic style is they're really good at welcoming people into their home, making people feel at home. If they're not so good with words, bring other people into your home. Throw a dinner party. Invite some neighbors, invite other friends from church. Bring the person from church who's a loud mouth, who can really communicate well. And then your gifts work very well collaboratively. And the other person, of course, who's written on this, Rosario Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. So I think sometimes, again, we've restricted ourselves to thinking, well, evangelism has to look like someone who's really good at their words, whether that's asking questions or giving answers. But actually, there's complementary styles of evangelism that come alongside that. And I love, Paul reminds us in his letters, that metaphor of the body. God has put us together into communities where there are different skills. All of us are called to be involved in the Great Commission, but we have different parts and different ways we can play our role in that.
Yeah, I think Rodney Stark, who's a scholar, historian, and who wasn't a Christian when he wrote some of these ideas, but he points to the huge plague that broke out in Rome during the reign of Domitian, and he said while the aristocracy and the Roman elite were moving to the countryside as this plague was ravaging, and they were leaving relatives to abandon them because they were infected and things of that nature. While they're walking out of the city, the Christians were walking in, and he notes that certain Christians, of course, they caught the plague and died, but others were nursing these individuals back to health, and it did 2 things. First of all, it did bring in an immunity to those who survived, and secondly, all of those Romans who recovered they said, well, I think I'm going to be a Christian because they're the ones who cared for me. They're the
Mm.
ones who, yeah, and so he points to that as one of the major explosions in the growth of Christianity in the early days of Rome, which is a really
Yeah.
interesting
Well, one of my favorite moments in
concept.
Roman history, of course, a little bit later, you come. I think it's under the time under the era of Julian the Apostate. I think is the Roman emperor who writes that letter, doesn't he, to the pagan temples, complaining that they're doing a terrible job looking
Yes.
after the poor. And I think he refers to the hated Galileans, not just feeding their own poor, they're feeding our poor. And there's this lovely moment in early church history where actually, where really was the difference that's being made. And I think the same applies to today. The one thing I say that's important here, though, is I think, this era that we live in where it's tougher to be a Christian. One thing, Lenny, I do occasionally come across, or quite often come across, I'll often come across Christians who take what you and I have just said and go, great, okay, well, my style of evangelism is therefore to be a very lovely, friendly, caring person at work or in my community, such that people look at me and then figure out I'm a Christian and good things will happen. Sometimes those words, Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words, is wheeled out. Well, of course, the thing is, Francis never said that. It's a historical myth. The guy was quite capable of using words. But also, I'll say to people, the problem is if that's all that you do, because you're afraid of speaking out, the problem is your friends and your colleagues and your neighbours won't assume that you're being generous because you're a Christian. They'll just think you're a lovely person. And ironically, you've drawn attention to yourself and not to Christ. So the message is therefore I'm not saying therefore be a jerk for Jesus, but I am saying, be kind, be loving, be compassionate, be hospitable, all those things that God has equipped you to be if you're that kind of servant-hearted person. But then with fear and trepidation, when someone says, thank you for what you did for me, that was amazing what you did, to say, you need to know I did that because I wanted to show you the love that God has for you that I found in Christ. And trust me, it's much harder for your friend to mock if you've just gone the extra mile and done something incredible for somebody. So yeah, again, anything we can do to bring together the pastoral, the social concern, and proclamation together, our witness becomes really powerful.
Well, yeah, I completely agree. I think that's wonderful. So, what else are we missing, Andy? What haven't we talked about that we need to talk about here?
The only thing we haven't talked about, Lenny, and I think we've kind of touched on it and danced around it, is one of the things that for me was as a passion in writing the book as well is one of the sort of final little block of chapters talks about how we bring these conversations to land on Christ. Because one of the things I noticed in my apologetic career is that without meaning to, it's very easy to have highfalutin conversations about big philosophical questions. We've mentioned the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm not beating up on that. It's a very clever argument. But you can talk about these things and suddenly without realizing you haven't brought Jesus into it. You've just talked about an idea or you've talked about theism in general. But I think it's really important as Christians, we then also learn how to bring Jesus into these conversations. And so that's a big part of the book as well, helping people figure out the questions to ask, figure out how to have natural conversations, but then to be looking for the time in that conversation where, God willing, you'll be able to say, this is a really interesting conversation. Do it reminds me of something that Jesus said, or it reminds me of something that Jesus did, or it reminds me of a story that Jesus told. However you make that bridge, and I teach various ways in the book, because I increasingly think, quite frankly, that any argument, any apologetic that doesn't either begin or end with Jesus and the cross probably doesn't deserve the title Christian.
Yes.
So it's just making sure that, and there's an irony there actually, that as Christian apologists sometimes we can bang on about things and not connect. So that's the one thing we haven't talked about. We've kind of skirted around that. And so to encourage people listening to this who love this stuff, let's make sure that our apologetics is thoroughly Christian.
Yeah, I think
that,
that is very, very important. We're not just talking about the God of the philosophers. Absolutely.
Well, and back to our old friend, Clive Staples Lewis. Of course, Lewis is fascinating, right? In one sense, he's partly a poster boy for this, I think, because atheist for 30 years, pretty much of his life. then discovers that the things he cares the most about, the stuff that he's experiencing and seeing in music and beauty and art and literature, joy, as he later calls it, doesn't make any sense on his atheism. So he journeys through, as atheism, idealism, sort of pantheism, theism, finally figures out there is a God, and then bows the knee. And as he puts it, that I finally gave in, admitted that God was God, bowed the knee, and became that night the most reluctant convert in the whole of England. Well, of course, at that point, Lewis is just a theist. He's not a Christian. And it takes him 2 years. I still find that mind-boggling. There's Lewis. He's left the atheist phase, but for 2 years, he's sort of trying to figure out where Christ fits in. And then it's famously in a walk one evening in Oxford with J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, his two mates, who really help him connect the dots. And then not long after that, he becomes a Christian.
The true myth, and on the motorcycle ride.
That's
with
right.
His brother.
That's right, with his brother, with Warney. And so, but the point is that shows you how people can make that journey in stages, and that becomes really important, because we talked earlier about the public intellectual kind of shift that's really accelerating in Europe. I think it's just beginning in the States. So you mentioned Douglas Murray. Jordan Peterson was a name we didn't mention. You listen to Jordan. Here is somebody who is sounding increasingly, God talk coming in. But these men and women haven't. If we can't just get encouraged and go, hey, they're using God talk. Isn't it brilliant? We need to be praying that there are Christians in their lives who can go, no. This is the start. But you need far more than this. It's not just God in general, but Jesus in the particular. And so as Christians, learning to be sure that we're doing that is crucial.
Okay, so I do have a question for you. You had said that you were reluctant to say get on an airplane because what you ultimately understood it to be was a control issue. You'd like to be in control.
Yeah.
Yet, I see that you have a wedding ring on your finger. Now, how do those two things work together?
Wedding rings and airplanes.
Marriage in airplanes, because I find I'm not in control if I'm married.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, there we go. Exactly. Oh gosh, it's very fortunate my wife is not within earshot, because you'd be getting a third voice of this conversation going, Andy may still occasionally wrestle with that one, to go, yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things. I think it's interesting that the fear piece actually came of having to partly let go of the control thing. And also I do think that everyone who's passionate about apologetics and the life of the mind when it comes to evangelism, theology, Lenny, all of us need a spouse who is wife.
Absolutely.
I'm very careful to say wife, because I have, I think of someone like my friend Mary Jo Sharp, who's a brilliant apologist.
Yeah, I know Mary Jo and Amy Orr Ewing, and
Roger is Roger Sharp or Frog or Ewing. They are quite different to their wives, and I think having somebody who could look at it and go, that sounds great. How does that work in real life? And also for me, I love one of the things
she says, let me tell you about leaving the toothpaste on the counter.
That's exactly the thing. I think so. And also I think the other thing I found really interesting watching, what I've been really interested over the years watching the way, for example, my wife does ministry, because she's really good at the one-to-one. We moved house a couple of years ago. The street that we're in here, in the town that we live in, she's done this beautiful job building relationships with lots of the older women in the street and the mums, and watching her weave the gospel through that. Now, what's funny is Astrid would say she's not really into apologetics, but she uses it when she needs to. She just doesn't use the word. And I love the way that God's brought the two of us together, because I think joking aside, she would say she's learned lots from me. I learn lots from her daily. So I think, but it's interesting, the control thing.
yeah. If you want humility, you need to be married, because that'll spouses will humble you. They know all your quirks, they know all your flaws.
As somebody once said, if you think you're perfect and there's nothing wrong with you, the best solution is to get married, because you discover very, very, very quickly. And by the way, very, very seriously, because the evangelist in me can never help these kind of things, I think also when with marriage, which for many of us, when the blessing of children then comes along, I don't think I really appreciated what the love of God actually meant until I became a father myself. And
it does change your view, and you do understand how neglect even neglect that especially as children age. Now my boys are all over 21. I have 4 boys. I tell people my wife is a member of the Moab tribe, mothers of all boys. And so they're all older now, but as they get busy, one of them's a touring musician and you don't see him for a while and things like that. And you start to say, wow, I really, really miss them. And it's like, wow, you know what? And how's your prayer life doing? How you're worried about your kids calling home, and how recently have you talked to God? And there's definitely parallels there that you can learn.
Yeah. And the other one, I think, for me, Lenny, was when my daughter was my firstborn, when my daughter came along in 2012. I can remember, the first one of my early experiences of holding her and just feeling this incredible love for this, thing that at that point has no instrumental use at all, just cries and poos and makes a mess. But that love for someone who can't at that point love properly in return, that was a really interesting insight too into the way that, God, that really amazing sense of this is how it is for God, that we like to think we can do something for him in a small pathetic way, but God has no need of us at all whatsoever, yet loves us so tremendously. And of course, in the person of Jesus, Romans 5 verse 8, demonstrated his love by giving everything for us. So anyway, so marriage and parenting, I think it softens one slightly as an evangelist and an apologist, or I hope it has in my case.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, the book again is How to Talk About Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot. The subtitle is A Panic-Free Guide to Having Natural Conversations About Your Faith. And I'll go ahead, I'll put a link to that. I'll also put a link to your other books that we had mentioned, Andy, so folks who are interested can grab them. Anything you'd like to close with before we sign off?
I think the main thing I would close with, Lenny, is just to encourage people to get out there and get into conversations. If you're listening to this and you do that all the time, brilliantly. If you're a slightly more nervous person, give it a go. And then the other thing I would say, which we haven't talked much about, again, we can assume these things in conversations. We don't name it. Get praying as well, because by far the most powerful thing we can do for evangelism is be praying each day that God would open up opportunities. Pray for your friends, pray for your neighbors, pray for your colleagues. I find the more that we pray, the more those opportunities open up. Absolutely. So make sure that we're leading with that and what we do as well.
So really quickly, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
You have to buy the book. 85% no, 15% yes is the answer to that. In a nutshell, Lenny, the problem with that question, it's too big a question. Yeah. It tries to do too much. Break it down into, does the Quran describe the same God as the God of the Bible? Categorically no. But are some Muslims in unknown God territory, Acts 17, are there some Muslims who are actually, I think, reaching out for the God of the Bible, though they may not know it? Yes. Yeah. And my dear friend died a few years ago, my dear friend Nabil Qureshi, whose book Seeking Allah Finding Jesus. Nabil was a dear friend. I think that was his story. Hence the book title. Right. He thought he was seeking Allah.
Right.
But actually,
I'll have to tell you my Nabil story at some point. But
I look forward to that one.
So okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Andy. So appreciate it. You've been listening to Come Let Us Reason Together, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks again.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.